Hello, and today I want to talk about Frank Norris and his work Vandover and the Brute. So, Vandover and the Brute, sorry, was written in 1894. It was written around the same time of Frank Norris's more well-known novel McTeague, but they were written around the same time, but this one he couldn't get published during his lifetime, so it would not be until after he died. And so I think around 1914, the manuscript was discovered and then finally published. So that was actually over 10 years after his death. Now notice I just said he basically wrote this book in college in 1894, and he was dead a decade in 1904. So that's one of the brutal realities of Frank Norris's life. One of the great American writers, a writer with so much potential, a writer who, even in the works he created, he just left such a huge imprint and such a huge impact on American writing that it's almost mind-boggling. He died at really tragically young age of 32, but he still left this very, very impressive body of work. It consists of 4 novels, one of which, of course, was only published after he died. The other ones, so that's Vandover and the Brute. He also wrote McTeague, and then he wrote 2 of a planned 3-volume series on wheat. The first one's called The Octopus, which is about the railroad. The second is called The Pit, which is about the Chicago grain elevators and kind of the financial machinations behind all that. And then the final one, he never even really got into writing before he died. So they only left those 4 novels, but it's such a big impact on American literature, it really can't be denied. He's of a school of writing called Naturalism. And Naturalism, as I understand it, was a branch off of the Realist school. Yet they did a few things different than the Realists. While the Realists were interested in really recreating like a snapshot of reality in every scene, the Naturalists were more after realism as it reflected social ills and social inequalities and social problems of various sorts. And that's one thing. So they tended to focus on kind of the dirty, ugly side of life. And that's certainly true in all of Frank Norris's novels, which all deal with one way or another with the nastiness, the brutality, the indifference to each other. And, you know, all his works in some ways are a criticism of capitalism. I don't know if you call him a socialist. I don't think he ever identified really as a socialist, but he's writing at the time, you know, the early progressive era, the time of the populists, the time when the Gilded Age is starting to be questioned more and more by writers such as Jack London and Frank Norris and Theodore Dreiser and others who were active at that time. So the other thing the naturalists do, as I understand it, is really start to try to investigate the reality of how people, you know, experienced things and thought about things. And so there's a little bit more of an effort to get at an internal monologue and to reflect the individual experiences of people rather than just present them how they might, you know, realistically from the outside, rather really get into their minds and their experiences. Another thing to say about Frank Norris is he's really a self-conscious California writer, and he talked in some of his essays, and they're included in this volume. He writes about the need for like the novelist of the West or the California novelists, and he really was upset that there wasn't like an identifiable tradition of Western writing and Western literature. So, Vandover and the Brute. This novel is really it's quite entertaining, it's quite rich, it has a lot to offer. You know, if you only had to read one Frank Norris novel, I wouldn't say to read this one. I would suggest to read maybe The Octopus or probably McTeague. They kind of get to him better, but if you have the time to spend, it's in the Library of America version, it's like 250 pages maybe. Around 250 pages. So it's not very long. It's a relatively quick read. It really focuses on one character, Vandover, and it's basically about an artist, a quite talented artist who graduates from Harvard, but through bad luck, bad habits, and being taken advantage of by others, but mostly due to his own failings and his own problems. He basically is driven into poverty by the end of the novel. On the surface, it is the reverse Horatio Alger story, and therefore it does read at times like a morality tale, much more so than I think like The Octopus or McTeague do. I haven't read The Pit ever, but only those first three are included in this Norris collection by the Library of America. Really something I'd recommend. But in this one, it does read more like a lecture, and it's much more about like his own internal faults. You don't feel that as much in McTeague. Yeah, the characters are flawed in McTeague, but it's a little bit more understandable. Vandover is not a sympathetic character at all. It's very hard to feel any to have much feeling for him at all. That's what I want to say. He's not a very likable character. And you might here's really where the debate of this book would lie, I think, for a lot of readers, is how much do we blame Vandover for his faults, or how much is he really a victim of a system? And there are characters who take advantage of him, who exploit him. There are structural things in his life. Even though he was born rich, that's part of the problem he faces. He certainly does squander a talent. He certainly mistreats women. He certainly is quite cowardly. He doesn't have a work ethic. So there's a lot to blame on Vandover, but then some people might look to say, no, it's not so much his fault. It might be the system he's in. So he is destroyed by the society around him. He's also destroyed in part by its expectations and its pressures. And I think that's one thing that made it hard for him to be true to himself as a character, because he was an artist and a fairly talented one. And he was happiest when he was involved in his art. But his art was often conflicted with the social expectations, his social circle, going out, and what his father and his family expected of him. And it was hard for him to get into his true love of our art, partially because of family pressures and other things he faced from his family, his friends, and those kinds of external factors. And then by the end of the novel, he's just another poor person being exploited by people more powerful than him. And a lot of that is not really his fault. It's whatever evils he committed earlier in his life, he was still an exploited figure by the end of the novel. So if we trace his life a little bit, we can start to see some of the building blocks towards his ultimate failure. Now, certainly he inherits a lot of problems. He was given a false sense of wealth. This is an important point. Vandover's father was a very, very skilled lawyer who was able to use the system and use banking and mortgages and other kind of financial tricks to present a false facade of wealth. And this is maybe a critique of the entire Gilded Age America, where there's a lot of financial wheeling and dealing that created a lot of wealth, apparently out of nowhere. That's what Vandover's father did. And so Vandover grew up thinking he was a rich man when in fact he wasn't that rich. And after his father dies, he starts to learn more about the financial realities, that most of the properties he had were mortgaged. And, what his father would do is he would buy a property, rent it out, and then mortgage it to get the down payment for another home, and then mortgage that. And so basically all the wealth he had was heavily mortgaged. And basically he was staying ahead by the fact that as long as interest payments were a little bit less than the rent, he was able to provide himself a nice monthly income, but he never was paying off these mortgages. So when he died, he passed on this burden to his son, who was completely unprepared for a life of frugality and modesty. In fact, much of what he did could have almost been criminal in the way he kind of was cooking the books. So Vandover grew up in luxury, and he was allowed to pursue his art, and he was allowed to believe that he could have a life as kind of a leisure class artist. And he was talented, and he could have started his career right away, but he went to Harvard to satisfy the expectations of his father and his friends, who also went off to Harvard. And it's at Harvard that he started to get an appreciation for vulgar passions: drink, smoking, and then women. These are his big sins, and he has them throughout the novel. He never gives them up. Gambling is added to this later on, but so it's really gambling, smoking, drinking, and girls, right? And really the greatest crime of Vandover in this entire novel is, in one point, he date rapes someone, and it's not clear if it's the only time he did it, but it's he certainly was mistreating women at other times in the novel, and he plays with women. And there's a nice girl that he probably could have married or should have married or maybe considered marrying, but he never took her seriously, and he was just kind of playing around for much of his young adulthood. But at one point he date rapes a woman, and later on, she kills herself. And he has to come to terms with what he did, and he's never fully accepts the reality of what he did to this woman, even though other people know. His friends seem to know what he did, and some confront him a little bit on that. The girl's father certainly blames him, and in fact goes so far as to sue him, which contributes to his financial pressures. So again, my point is, you can really read this in different ways, and I've read it twice, and the first time I read it, I was sort of sympathetic with Vandover's plight because I wanted to see all these systemic causes. And the second time I read it, I felt much more that he was really kind of a spoiled, pampered, vulgar, useless character who's had all kinds of sins, one of which was he squandered his gift because he didn't have a work ethic. He didn't really want to put his work behind him. And I'm not the biggest fan of the work ethic itself, but when you have a talent, when you have a gift, I think... And you don't cultivate it, and you're miserable and poor and a failure because of it, that's partially on you. So, gifts need to be cultivated. We're probably going to be most sympathetic with Vandover at one part of the novel when he suffers all these disasters in his life. And it culminates, he's actually in a shipwreck at one point, and he barely escapes with his life. He gets to the shore, and it's pretty much that day he learns his father died, and he actually went out like on a binge drinking at the very time his father was dying, and he came home to find his father dead, and he has to come to terms with all this guilt he's feeling. And then he learns like his financial situation is much worse than he thought. He'd have to actually get a job, and things start to get from bad to worse. And then this is added on to this as he gets sued by this girl's father for violating his daughter and leading to her suicide, basically kind of like a wrongful death suit he's placed with, and he loses a lot of money for that. He gets taken advantage of by a friend who became a really good lawyer, and a lot of his property is bought up from him. And in kind of a really bitter twist at the end of the novel, he's actually fixing up and repairing. He's working as a janitor in those homes that he once owned and rented out to other people. So you need to balance like the sense that there's systemic exploitations going on in his life and distractions and real barriers to him achieving success. At the same time, he has this huge sense of entitlement. He was basically cushioned from a lot of reality by his father and the circle he was in, and he never really had to grow up. And there's a juvenilism to this character that I think lives throughout his life, and he never fully grows up. We see how impressionable Vandover is when Norris writes relatively early in the book, actually. Gradually, Vandover allowed his ideas and tastes to be molded by this new order of things. He assumed the manners of the young men in the city, very curious to see for himself the other lower side of their life that began after midnight in the private rooms of the fast cafes that were continued in the heavy, musk-laden air or certain parlors amid the rustle of the heavy silk. Slowly, the fascination of this thing grew in him until he mounted to a veritable passion. His strong artist imagination began to be filled with a world of charming, sensuous pictures." End quote. Now, certainly many of us can sympathize for that there is something attractive to the nightlife, and there's one reason people like to go out, right? It takes us away from the world, and it's a social experience, and there's scents and smells and experiences and feelings that you don't always get in your everyday mundane life that you get kind of in the nightlife. So there's a reason that's attractive to us kind of at almost a biological or sensory level. But Vandover is a character that just allows us to take him over entirely. Another problem is the world that Vandover is living in is slowly or even rapidly being taken over and degraded by industrialization. And what's left of him, of his life, is like this stuffy middle-class culture that's what you expect of him. He's from the middle class, and so he's expected to be this way. But that doesn't really interest him, and so he he goes off to this culture of cafes and public amusements, cheap liquor and cheap sex, and he floats between the two for much of the novel. And so his disaster really comes when he, seduces. He really, it's a little bit, the way it's talked about is really cagey, and doesn't really come out and say it, but essentially he date raped this woman Ida in a lowbrow parlor. She becomes pregnant and she kills herself. He's unable to handle the moral burdens of this, so he goes off to sea. And so it's again this juvenilism, is he can't really face his sins, and he has to go off and just escape, and that's what he always does, and that's why he never really can grow up and really get handle of it. And there's times when you actually read about his financial situation after his father dies. To him, it's a disaster. It's like the end of the world, but when you actually compute the figures and compute them into contemporary dollars, he's not that bad off. He could have lived still a modest leisure class life without having to work just off these rents and things. But he didn't want to live that way, and he couldn't get past what he wanted in his head, and that certainly made it difficult for him to cope with any changes in his life. And I think this might be a metaphor more broadly for various people unable to cope with the rapidly changing America of the late 19th century. Now, depending on how you take the character, and you take Vandover in the first half of the novel, the second half of the novel can be a brutal, agonizing experience, or it can be kind of a lot of schadenfreude to enjoy as you watch this character rapidly decline, and as the situation gets worse and worse. And it's really in the second half of the novel, though, that the brute emerges. And the brute is actually almost a second personality of Vandover, which he'll actually descend into kind of a wolfman kind of character. And people will hear strange noises from his apartment at times. And, he'll be on his hands and knees. And so sometimes it's literally, he almost becomes like a wolfman. It's kind of at night, he gets really weird. But in more general, it's just, he just degrades, and he becomes much more brutish as a person. He gets involved in gambling, he drinks more, he smokes more. He kind of loses his ability to kind of interact with women through all of this as he declines more and more. But he keeps a lot of these sins and vices. And there are times he just burns through cash like crazy. At one point, he turns in like all his, he had some seeds, like some treasury bills or something that I was getting some interest from, like $50 a month or something. But at that time, it was enough to live off of. But at one point, he just cashes them all, and he blows all the money in kind of a massive binge of a couple days. It's amazing how he's able to spend all this money. But this is kind of him being his brute side. And I know this is going to sound waffly, but sometimes I really do feel for Vandover. For instance, a lot of what he seems to want is camaraderie, companionship, community, and he loses that, and it's very juvenile at times. And his friends, his college friends, grow up and become hard-nosed capitalists, or a couple stay more friendly to him, but still tell him, you gotta grow up out of this. But Vandover seems to remember the good old days of college quite fondly, and he always wants to relive them and re-experience them. And what he really likes about it is the community and the camaraderie and the friendships he has. And in a world where it's quickly becoming kind of a social Darwinian struggle for survival, Vandover's desire for something a little bit more is something I think that we can sympathize with, even if we can still step away from it and say, this guy really does at some point have to grow up if he wants to be a fully formed individual, and especially if he wants to be an artist. He has to get a handle of his art. And by the second half of the novel, he's like an artisan. He's like painting boxes, like decorative painting on boxes, and he gives up that. I mean, he actually starts declining in that very simple work, and he never really paints again. But he had the potential to be a fairly adequate artist, even, and was working on a great painting at one point. That would have been his life's work. So one final thing I want to say about Vandover and the Brute is the novel can also be read as an allegory for the proletarization of people who, of any class, but Vandover's experience is going from independence and a relative degree of freedom and the ability to have a craft and a little bit of autonomy and creative freedom, which of course many workers had before industrialization and scientific management, and these things took that away and broke it up. By the end of the novel, he can't go back to that. He's lost the ability to do those things, and all he can really be is a janitor and a worker. And he's doing that to survive, and he doesn't really like it, obviously, but he can only, all he has left at the end of the novel is his labor. So he is, in a sense, proletarianized by the end of the story. And it is fair to say that some of his wealth was taken from him by trickery. For instance, when he was sued by this girl's father, his old friend came in, who's now a lawyer, and he works out a deal with this man, but that deal only benefited the lawyer, and the lawyer makes a lot of money from that, and that exploitation would actually continue in the end. And this is the same guy that Vandover ended up working for, cleaning old buildings for peanuts. So Norris carefully moves Vandover step by step into the working class, and we see this, in pretty much every page, especially by the end, is pretty clear that's happening. And what Vandover is most fearful of at the end of the story is his loss of companionship and the loss of his art. And he doesn't care as much about the loss of his invested wealth. He cares that he's lost that life he's once had and the potential. And it's quite sad. Right at the end of the novel, he says, quote, "I guess you can't give me any work that would be too dirty for me. I want to be honest, Mr. Geary. I want to be honest. I'm down and I don't mean to offense. Charlie, you and I were old chums once at Harvard. My God, to think I was a Harvard man once. Oh, I'm a goner now and I ain't got a friend. When I was in the paint shop, they paid me well. I've been in the paint shop lately painting little pictures on the safes, little landscapes, and lakes and mountains around them. I pulled down $20 in findings." End quote. This is right at the final pages of the novel when he's given this desperate plea to his old friend for a job as a janitor. And all he can think about is that he once was a painter and he once had friends. And it's quite tragic, but all he is at the end is a commodified worker, a proletariat. And that's kind of on top of him being a drunken vagrant. Again, depending on how you read this, if you want to read it more as a morality tale, you can do that, and then you're going to focus on his sins and his vices and the fact that he ends up sort of as a drunken vagrant. But if you do want to be a little more sympathetic to Vandover, then you want to focus a little bit on the systemic issues here, and that it's not entirely his fault. So anyways, lots of ways to read this novel. It's a good one to pick up. It's a nice introduction to Frank Norris. I probably, if you had to only read one, I would recommend probably McTeague, which I'll talk about probably in an upcoming video, or The Octopus if you have the time to get into it. The Octopus is, I think, 500 pages, so it's a little bit of a longer read. But this is, if you have the time, if you like to read only two of his novels, I think this one's nice, even though it does come off preachy at times. I think if you get beyond that and you start to try to look at it different ways, it has a lot to offer. And it's a nice window into, it's a nice critique, I guess, of Gilded Age America and its falseness and its susceptibility to vices and, the failure of image, right? Especially with Vandover's father. I think there's a really strong case for, the falseness of reality. As presented by the ruling class, right? Like what's under the wealth is a very false, a very weak foundation. So anyways, you can get it, it's probably in print in various ways, but you can get it in the Library of America version of Frank Norris's collected works. If you want to hear more of our reviews, please subscribe. I am going through Library of America volumes, looking at those works in there. I'm also going to be working on Philip K. Dick, and I already have some Philip K. Dick episodes up, and I may be doing some other things as well. So.